The sun was setting across the wide desert land, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. The wind carried dust from the dry ground and the sound of horses echoed in the distance. This was the Wild West, a place of endless open spaces but also of deep struggles. In the middle of this world lived a young Apache woman named Naya. Her spirit was strong, but her life was not her own. She had been taken from her people during a raid years ago and forced to live as a servant in a wealthy rancher's house. To the outside world, she looked like part of the ranch, someone always working silently in the background. But to herself, she knew she was trapped. Every morning before the sun even rose, Naya was already awake. She carried buckets of water from the well, her arms aching with every trip. She cleaned the stables, brushed the horses, and cooked meals she was never invited to eat. She wore simple clothes that were given to her, rough and worn, and her long black hair was often tied back to keep it out of her face as she worked. She rarely spoke, not because she had nothing to say, but because no one wanted to hear her voice. She had learned long ago that silence kept her safe, but inside her heart there was still a flame. Sometimes, when no one was watching, she would hum songs from her childhood. They were soft, almost whispers, but they reminded her that she was more than what her captors saw. She was the daughter of her people, a girl who had once laughed freely in the mountains, who had danced under the stars with her family. Those memories were all she had to hold on to. Life on the ranch moved in the same pattern every day. The rancher gave orders, the workers followed, and Naya carried out her tasks without question. But one evening, something unusual happened. A cowboy named James rode into the ranch, his horse kicking up dust as he dismounted. He was tall, with a rugged look that showed years of travel under the sun. He came for supplies, the same way many travelers did, but unlike others, he noticed things most people ignored. As James tied his horse near the stable, his eyes fell on Naya. She was carrying a heavy sack of grain, her back bent slightly under its weight. For a moment, their eyes met. She quickly looked away, used to hiding her presence, but something in that short glance stayed with him. It wasn't just the tiredness in her face. It was the quiet strength she carried, even in silence. James greeted the rancher and spoke about the supplies he needed. The rancher boasted about his land, his cattle, and the men who worked for him. Naya was nearby, sweeping the porch, her presence barely acknowledged. When the rancher barked at her to move faster, James noticed the harsh tone. He said nothing then, only watched, but inside he felt uneasy. He had traveled across many towns, seen many people, and he knew when someone was being treated unfairly. Later that evening, as James prepared to leave, he passed by Naya again. This time he offered a simple nod, a gesture of respect that startled her. No one ever greeted her like that. She gave a small nod back, almost too quick to notice, and went on with her work. James mounted his horse and rode off. But as the ranch faded behind him, his thoughts kept returning to the woman with the quiet eyes. Over the next few weeks, James found reasons to return. Sometimes he came for feed, other times for tools. Each visit he saw Naya working silently in the background. She never complained, never slowed down, but he could see the weariness in her steps. He began to greet her each time with a gentle smile or a few words. At first she was cautious. She had learned not to trust easily, especially strangers. But slowly she began to respond with the smallest of gestures, a glance, a nod, a faint smile when no one was looking. For James, those small moments grew meaningful. He realized she was not invisible, even if the rancher treated her that way. He began to wonder about her story. Who was she before she came here? What dreams did she once hold? He wanted to ask, but he knew that pushing too fast could bring her harm. So he waited, showing respect in little ways, hoping to earn her trust. Meanwhile, Naya noticed the difference in him. Most men spoke to her only to give orders, but James spoke as though she mattered. He never raised his voice, never looked at her with cruelty. She began to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It was a fragile feeling, like a small plant trying to grow in dry soil, but it was there. One afternoon, while James was loading supplies onto his horse, he saw Naya trip while carrying water. The heavy bucket fell, splashing across the ground. The rancher's men laughed, calling her careless. Naya quickly bent to pick it up, her face calm even though her heart ached. James, without a second thought, stepped forward to help her lift the bucket. The men sneered at him, but he ignored them. "It's heavy," he said softly to Naya. For a brief moment she looked up at him with gratitude shining in her eyes. That moment stayed with both of them, though neither spoke about it. As the sun went down that day, James rode away once more, but his heart was no longer at peace. He knew the truth now. Naya was not just a servant. She was a woman living in chains, hidden behind silence. He didn't know what he would do yet, but deep inside he felt a pull stronger than anything he had known before. Something told him that his path and hers were meant to cross in a way that could change both their lives forever. And so, while the desert nights grew colder and the days passed with the same rhythm, a quiet story was beginning to take shape. Naya still woke before dawn, still carried water and swept the floors, but now, somewhere in her heart, there was a flicker of light. A cowboy had seen her. Cowboy had treated her as human, and in the Wild West, where freedom was rare and survival was hard, that flicker was enough to give her strength to face another day. The weeks rolled on, and the ranch carried the same rhythm of life. Cattle moving across the land, ranch hands shouting orders, and the steady creak of wooden wagons. For Naya, each day blended into the next. She carried her duties with the same quiet strength, but now something was different. Somewhere in her heart, there was a memory of kindness, of a cowboy who treated her not as a shadow but as a person. She tried to push the thought aside, afraid it would bring disappointment, but it stayed with her like a hidden ember. James, too, found himself thinking about her more often than he expected. He was not a man who usually stayed in one place for long. The West had made him restless, always pushing him from one town to another, chasing work or simply chasing the horizon. But after meeting Naya, he discovered reasons to return to the same ranch. Even if it was just for supplies he didn't urgently need. Each time he came, he told himself he would simply get what he needed and ride away. But each time his eyes searched for her. On one such visit, James arrived just as the sun was dipping low, washing the ranch in golden light. He saw Naya near the corral, brushing down a tired horse. Her hands moved gently, her face calm, though her clothes were dusty and her hair loose from a long day's work. He dismounted and approached the rancher to discuss supplies, but his eyes kept straying back to her. It was not just her presence but the way she carried herself, silent yet unbroken, that struck him. As he finished his business with the rancher, James noticed a moment when Naya paused her work. For the first time, their eyes met for longer than a second. She gave the faintest of nods, almost like a secret greeting. It was nothing grand, nothing anyone else would notice, but for James it felt important. It told him that she saw him too, that his small kindnesses had not gone unnoticed. That evening, as he prepared to leave, James walked past her. He tipped his hat and said softly, "Take care." The words were simple, but they carried warmth. Naya didn't answer with words. She was not allowed to, but her eyes held a quiet response. It was enough. James rode off, but his mind was full of questions. What had she endured? Why did no one see the injustice of her life? And what, if anything, could he do? Back on the ranch, Naya replayed the small moment in her mind. For so long she had been treated as invisible, yet here was someone who noticed her. She did not allow herself to dream too far, for dreams had been dangerous in the past, but she began to feel a thread of trust weaving itself between her and the cowboy. She carried water, prepared meals, and swept the floors as before, but the weight of her days seemed just a little lighter. One afternoon, as the men gathered outside drinking and laughing, James returned again. He brought tools this time, and as he spoke with the rancher, he overheard the workers mocking Naya. They laughed about her silence, calling her names, speaking as though she were not even human. James felt his jaw tighten, but he kept calm. He knew if he acted too quickly, he could draw unwanted attention. Instead, he simply walked over to where Naya was working and handed her one of the tools she needed. The men fell quiet for a moment, surprised that he would even acknowledge her. James ignored their stares and spoke to her gently. "This should help." Naya looked at him, her hands brushing the wooden handle of the tool. Her eyes held both surprise and gratitude. She whispered a soft word, barely audible, but James caught it. "Thank you." It was the first time she had spoken to him. For James, the moment was small yet powerful. He nodded and stepped back, but inside he knew something had changed. From that day, their unspoken connection deepened. Each time James came, he found ways to show her quiet respect. Sometimes it was as simple as carrying a heavy sack so she wouldn't struggle. Other times it was offering a kind word. Naya, though cautious, began to meet his eyes more often. She started to trust that he was different, that his kindness was not a trick, but not everyone was blind. A few of the ranch hands noticed the way James treated her. They whispered among themselves, mocking the cowboy's actions. To them, Naya was just part of the ranch, not worthy of respect. James ignored their remarks, but he knew that every step he took closer to Naya carried risk. Still, he could not turn away. Something inside him told him that her freedom mattered more than his comfort. One evening, as James prepared to ride off again, he saw Naya carrying buckets of water. The sky was turning dark and the air was cool. He approached quietly and offered to take one of the buckets. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the house, fearful of being seen. But then slowly she allowed him to carry it alongside her. They walked together in silence, their steps steady, the sound of water sloshing in the wooden pails. It was a simple act, but for Naya, it felt like a moment of freedom, walking beside someone who treated her as an equal. When they reached the well, James set the bucket down and looked at her. "You don't deserve this life," he said softly, his voice steady but full of conviction. Naya's eyes widened. She wanted to respond, to tell him her story, but fear held her tongue. Instead, she looked at him with eyes that spoke louder than words, eyes that said she longed for freedom, that she had a story too heavy to carry alone. James mounted his horse and rode into the night, but his mind was no longer at rest. He knew now that he could not simply ride away and forget. Something had to change. Naya deserved more than silence, more than a life of servitude. And though the road ahead was uncertain, James began to feel a fire inside him, a fire that told him he could not ignore the call of justice. For Naya, that night was different too. As she lay down to rest in the small corner of the ranch house given to her, she thought about the cowboy's words. "You don't deserve this life." No one had ever said that to her before. It echoed in her mind like a song, stirring hope that perhaps, just perhaps, her story was not finished yet. The days grew longer as summer approached, the sun rising earlier and setting later, casting long shadows across the wide open plains. Naya moved through her chores with steady hands, but her thoughts often drifted to James. She did not fully understand why a cowboy, someone from the world outside her small, constrained life, had taken an interest in her. It was unusual, almost unimaginable for someone to see her as a person rather than a servant. Yet every act of kindness he showed, each quiet nod, each gentle word, left a mark on her heart. James, for his part, felt the weight of his intentions. He could not simply ride into town, buy supplies, and leave anymore. Something deeper had taken root in him. He thought of Naya not as someone to save, but as someone he wanted to protect and know. He worried for her when the ranch hands were cruel, laughed at her, or made demands she could barely manage. Each time he returned, he planned small ways to ease her burdens. Sometimes he brought extra food, other times he helped repair her worn clothing. Every gesture was quiet, almost invisible, but Naya noticed, and it strengthened the fragile trust between them. One morning, the rancher sent Naya to the fields with a group of workers to help mend the fences. She moved silently among them, carrying her tools carefully, keeping her head down. The men were rough, teasing her and testing her patience, but she endured. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind blew across the plain, lifting her scarf and tangling it in the fence posts. She struggled to free it, but her hands were scratched and the wind would not let her succeed. James appeared then, as if drawn by instinct, riding up swiftly. With calm hands, he untangled the scarf and brushed off the dust from her clothes. The men fell silent, surprised at how smoothly and kindly James handled the situation. He looked at Naya and said, "You should not have to struggle alone." His voice carried a warmth that was unusual in this harsh land. For Naya, his words were like sunlight breaking through a cloudy sky. She did not need to answer. Her grateful eyes said everything. From that day, small changes began to ripple through her life. Naya found herself walking a little taller, her shoulders less heavy with the burden of fear. She began to see that kindness could exist in the world, even here, surrounded by rough men and open plains. Each time James returned, she felt a flicker of hope, a tiny thread of courage stitching itself into her heart. She wondered if someday the life she dreamed of, a life of freedom and choice, might actually be possible. James, on the other hand, started speaking with the rancher more often, carefully testing the ground for a plan. He did not confront the cruel men directly. They were stubborn and could become dangerous, but he found ways to quietly improve Naya's life. A better place to sleep, Food stored for her own use, small tools to make her work easier. Every effort was measured, careful, but he could not hide the growing concern in his eyes. He knew that the longer she stayed in this life, the deeper the risk to her spirit. One evening, after the work was done and the men had gathered around the fire, James stayed behind. The sky was awash of orange and red, the clouds moving slowly across the horizon. Naya stood near the water trough, her hands roughened by her day's labor. James approached quietly, mindful of the others. "You work too hard," he said softly, almost a whisper. "You deserve a rest." She looked at him, her lips parting slightly, but no sound came. Still, the warmth in her eyes was a response. From that night, their interactions grew bolder, though still careful. James would speak to her when the others were not watching. He would leave small gifts, extra blankets for cold nights, fresh fruit if he had access to it from the nearby town. Naya began to respond in small ways. A nod here, a quick glance there, a soft smile when he helped her with a task. It was the first time in years that she felt noticed, that she felt her existence mattered. But life on the ranch was not without danger. One afternoon, as Naya tended the horses near the edge of the property, one of the rougher ranch hands approached. He mocked her clumsiness, pretending she had dropped a tool deliberately. Naya froze, unsure how to respond. Her fear was familiar, deep, and unrelenting. Just as the man reached to grab her arm, James appeared from the barn, his presence commanding. He placed himself between Naya and the man. "Back off," he said firmly, his voice steady but edged with steel. The ranch hand hesitated, recognizing the firmness in James's eyes. Slowly he stepped back, muttering under his breath. Naya's heart raced, but relief washed over her. For the first time, someone had truly protected her. She realized that James was not just a kind face. He was someone willing to stand up against the cruelty that had shadowed her life for so long. That moment stayed with her, giving her courage she had not known she possessed. Days turned into weeks, and Naya began to dream quietly. She imagined a life beyond the ranch, one where she could walk freely without fear of judgment or harsh treatment. She imagined sitting beside someone who truly cared for her, sharing laughter and warmth. Each thought felt daring, almost dangerous, but she could not stop them from coming. The more James showed kindness, the more her heart opened to the possibility of something new, something better. One night, under a sky full of stars, James and Naya found themselves alone by the creek at the edge of the property. The water reflected the moonlight and the air was calm. James handed her a small loaf of bread he had brought from town. "Eat," he said simply. Naya took it with hands that trembled slightly, grateful not just for the food but for the gesture. They sat by the water's edge, side by side, sharing silence and presence. In that quiet moment, Naya felt a bond forming, one that spoke of trust and hope. She remembered the life she had been forced to endure, and she felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for the years lost, but relief that someone like James had appeared in her life, willing to see her as more than the work she performed. And though she dared not speak of it yet, a small, flickering thought took root in her heart. Maybe freedom was not just a dream. Maybe with James's help it could become reality. Meanwhile, James's thoughts were restless. He could see the strength in Naya, the quiet resilience that had allowed her to survive hardship. He admired it deeply, and yet he was haunted by the knowledge that she had been treated as property, that the world had ignored her for so long. He began to plan in earnest, thinking about how he could help her escape the limitations of her life. He knew it would not be simple. There were too many eyes on her, too many men who would object. But he also knew that her courage matched his determination. Together they could face the obstacles ahead. As the summer sun warmed the plains and the days stretched long, small changes became apparent. The ranch hands began to whisper less and watch more. Unsure how to respond to James's unwavering support of Naya, she began to take small liberties, like choosing which horses to groom or adjusting the placement of tools to make work easier. Each act, no matter how minor, was a small step toward independence. And though fear still lingered, she discovered a strength inside herself she had not known existed. One day, while fetching water from the well, Naya slipped on the muddy ground. James, who had been nearby repairing a fence, caught her hand instantly. She looked up at him, startled, and saw something in his eyes she would never forget. Concern, care, and quiet determination. "You must be careful," he said gently. "You cannot do everything alone." Naya felt a warmth rise in her chest. For so long, no one had warned her to take care of herself. Here was someone who did. That night, she lay awake thinking about the day, about James, and about the life she could one day lead. She imagined the freedom to walk without fear, to speak without hesitation, to live without the chains of servitude. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she felt the first flicker of hope, a hope that would guide her through the challenges to come. The summer had reached its peak and the plains shimmered under the golden sun. The tall grass swayed in the warm breeze, and the sounds of cattle and birds created a rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the land. Naya had grown more confident in her daily routines, though the shadow of fear still lingered. She carried herself with a quiet strength now, a resilience that did not go unnoticed by James. Every time he watched her handle a difficult task with patience and precision, he felt a mixture of pride and admiration. James had begun to involve Naya in more important tasks around the ranch. He let her help with the planning of feeding schedules, the care of horses, and the organization of supplies. These responsibilities were small steps, but they mattered greatly. For Naya, it was the first time she had a say in matters that directly affected her life. She began to feel a sense of control, a rare feeling that made her heart lift with cautious excitement. One afternoon, James and Naya were checking the far fence line together. The sun was high, the heat making the air shimmer, and sweat ran down their faces. The work was hard, and the ground was uneven, but they moved with a rhythm that spoke of teamwork. James handed Naya a hammer and nails, guiding her hands as she learned the correct way to secure loose posts. She appreciated the patience he showed, the way he explained without ever making her feel inferior. For once, learning was not an ordeal. It was a shared effort, a connection that brought them closer. "You're doing well," James said quietly as he watched her drive the last nail home. "I know this work is not easy, but you're stronger than you realize." Naya felt a warm rush of gratitude, and for a moment, she allowed herself to smile. The praise was rare in her life, and it touched her deeply. She wanted to tell him how much it meant, but words felt inadequate. Instead, she simply nodded, letting her expression carry what she could not say aloud. As the weeks passed, whispers began among the ranch hands. They noticed the changes in Naya, the way she carried herself, and how James seemed to favor her. Some were curious, others resentful, and a few were outright hostile. Naya sensed their scrutiny and kept to herself, working quietly, always aware of eyes on her back. Yet despite the tension, she no longer felt powerless. She had James, and his presence was like a shield that protected her from the harshness of the world around her. One evening, as the sky blazed with shades of orange and pink, Naya sat on the porch of the small cabin where she slept. James joined her, carrying 2 cups of warm tea. The quiet of the evening wrapped around them, and for a while neither spoke. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers and grass, and the distant sound of cattle created a soft, comforting background. "Do you ever think about the life you want?" James asked finally, breaking the silence. His tone was gentle, careful, as if he were stepping into delicate territory. Naya looked at him, surprised by the question. It was not one she had allowed herself to consider for years. Her life had always been about survival, about meeting the demands placed upon her. Dreams felt dangerous, almost impossible. I used to think about it, she admitted slowly. A long time ago, but it always seemed out of reach. Her eyes were distant, reflecting memories of a childhood filled with constraints and quiet suffering. "I didn't think I could ever have a choice." James nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "You do have a choice now," he said softly. "You don't have to live under someone else's control. You can decide what you want, who you want to be, and how you want to live." His words were simple, but they carried a promise that made Naya's heart beat faster. She wanted to believe him, to hold on to the hope he offered. Over the next few days, their bond deepened. James shared stories of the world beyond the ranch, towns with markets, rivers where children played, open roads that stretched to the horizon. Naya listened, fascinated, imagining places she had never seen. Each story painted a picture of freedom, of life lived with choices rather than restrictions. Her curiosity grew, and with it, a sense of courage she had long thought lost. One afternoon, while repairing the barn roof, Naya lost her footing. She teetered dangerously, fear gripping her chest, but James was there instantly, He caught her arm, steadying her, and helped her to a safe spot. Her hands shook and her breath came in short bursts, but she realized something important. She was not alone. She did not have to face the world by herself anymore. "You don't have to be afraid all the time," James said gently, guiding her down the ladder. "You are capable. You are strong. And I will be here when you need help." Naya's eyes filled with a mix of relief and gratitude. The words, simple and unassuming, were like a lifeline, pulling her out of the darkness she had known for so long. As the days passed, Naya began to think more seriously about her future. She realized that the life she had endured, the life of fear and obedience, was not the only path available to her. There was a chance for something different, something better. But it would require courage, planning, and trust. She began to see that freedom was not a distant dream. It was within her reach. James, meanwhile, was not idle. He worked quietly to create opportunities for Naya, to prepare a way for her to step into a life of independence. He spoke to the rancher under the guise of business, buying time and resources that could be used to help her. He also taught Naya small skills like handling money, organizing supplies, and understanding the land in practical ways. These lessons were subtle but vital, each one a step toward self-reliance. One evening, after a long day of work, Naya and James sat by the fire. The stars were brilliant, scattered across the sky like tiny lanterns. Naya felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She realized that the bond between her and James had grown into something deeper: trust, respect, and an unspoken understanding. She no longer felt the weight of her past as heavily. There was a sense of possibility that was new and exhilarating. "You've come a long way," James said softly, breaking the quiet. "I can see the change in you. You are no longer just surviving. You are living." Naya looked at him, her heart swelling with emotion. She wanted to speak, to express the gratitude and admiration she felt, but words seemed too small for what she wanted to convey. Instead, she nodded, letting her expression carry what she could not say aloud. The next morning, a new challenge arose. One of the ranch hands, noticing Naya's growing confidence in James's protection, decided to test them. He created unnecessary tasks, pushed Naya beyond her limits, and tried to intimidate her. Naya felt the old fear rise, but she also felt a new strength within her. She remembered James's words and the trust he had shown in her abilities. She met the challenge with calm determination, completing the tasks with care and precision. James watched from a distance, pride swelling in his chest. He knew that Naya was discovering her own courage, her own strength. Each small victory built upon the last, and he could see that she was preparing herself for the greater freedom that awaited her. By midsummer, Naya's life had changed in subtle but powerful ways. She was more confident, more capable, and more aware of her own worth. The bond between her and James had grown into a quiet partnership, one built on trust, respect, and shared experience. Naya began to see that the life she had always dreamed of, a life of choice, freedom, and dignity, was possible. The path ahead was still uncertain, but with each passing day, the hope in her heart grew stronger. And so as the sun set over the plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Naya sat beside James, feeling the warmth of the fire and the presence of someone who truly cared. For the first time in her life, she felt that the future was not something to fear, but something to embrace. A life of freedom and love was no longer a distant dream. It was slowly becoming a reality. The first light of dawn painted the plains with soft pinks and golds. The world seemed calm, but for Naya it was a day filled with hope and nervous anticipation. She had spent weeks preparing herself, learning skills and gaining confidence under James's careful guidance. Today was the day she would take a step that would change her life forever. It was the day she would no longer be defined by fear or by the past. James stood beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. He had arranged everything carefully. The rancher, though surprised, had agreed to allow Naya to leave the constraints of her former situation. The other ranch hands were gathered, giving the morning a sense of ceremony. Naya felt the weight of attention, but instead of fear, she felt determination. She was ready to claim her life. "Are you ready?" James asked quietly, his hand brushing against hers. His touch was comforting, but it also carried the unspoken promise of support. Naya nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been ready for a long time, though it had taken courage to see it clearly. The ceremony was simple but meaningful. The rancher spoke briefly, acknowledging Naya's strength and resilience. He recognized the wrongs of the past and allowed her to step into freedom. For Naya, the words were more than just acknowledgement. They were validation. She had endured, she had grown, and now she was being recognized for her courage and spirit. As the final words were spoken, Naya felt a surge of emotion. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were tears of relief, of joy, and of hope. She looked at James, who nodded encouragingly. Together they walked out of the old constraints and into a life that was entirely their own. The first days after her freedom were a mixture of excitement and adjustment. Naya learned quickly how to manage her own time and responsibilities. She helped James with the ranch, but now her work was her choice, not an obligation forced upon her. She took pride in her abilities, in the way she could care for the animals, maintain the land, and make decisions. Each task completed without fear strengthened her confidence and reinforced her independence. James watched her with admiration. He had always seen her potential, but now he saw it fully realized. She was no longer the timid, frightened girl who had arrived months ago. She was a woman of strength, wisdom, and quiet authority. And yet, despite her independence, there was a gentle bond between them, one built on respect, trust, and shared experiences. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat together on the porch, looking out over the rolling plains. The sky was painted with the colors of sunset, and the air was filled with the comforting sounds of animals settling for the night. Naya leaned back, feeling the warmth of the setting sun on her face and the calm presence of James beside her. "I never thought I could feel like this," Naya said softly, her voice filled with wonder. "I never thought I could feel safe and free at the same time." James smiled, his eyes reflecting pride and affection. "You earned it," he replied simply. "You worked hard and you trusted yourself. That's what made it possible. You were never powerless, you just had to see it for yourself." Her heart swelled with gratitude. For so long, she had been told she was weak or incapable, but James had shown her that she had always possessed strength. He had guided her, but he had never forced her. Her freedom was entirely her own, and that made it all the more powerful. In the days that followed, Naya began to explore other possibilities. James encouraged her to learn new skills, riding horses across the plains, understanding the business side of ranching, and even reading letters from neighboring towns to stay informed about the wider world. Each new lesson brought a sense of empowerment. Naya realized that freedom was not just about leaving the past behind. It was about stepping forward into life with confidence and curiosity. Their bond deepened further as they shared more time together. James was careful to respect her space and her choices. He did not dominate or dictate. Instead, he offered guidance and support. Naya felt a sense of partnership she had never known. They laughed together, worked together, and shared quiet moments of reflection. Each day, Naya felt more like an equal, a person whose voice and presence mattered. One afternoon, they rode across the plains to check on the cattle. The wind whipped through their hair and the sun warmed their backs. Naya rode with ease, feeling the strength in her arms and the skill in her hands. She felt alive in a way she never had before. For the first time, the horizon seemed full of possibilities rather than threats. She could imagine herself traveling, learning, and building a life on her own terms. As they returned to the ranch, a small group of neighbors came by. They had heard of Naya's courage and her journey to freedom. Some came to offer congratulations, while others came out of curiosity. Naya greeted them with confidence, answering questions and sharing a few stories of her experiences. People looked at her with respect, and it was a heady feeling. She realized that she had not only gained freedom, but also recognition of her worth. That evening, under a sky filled with stars, James and Naya shared a quiet meal. The air was cool and the fire crackled gently beside them. Naya felt a deep sense of contentment. She had survived the trials of her past, embraced her new freedom, and discovered strength she had never known. And she had done it all with someone who cared for her, who had guided her without ever taking away her autonomy. "I never want to go back to the way things were," Naya said, looking at James with earnest eyes. "I want to keep building this life, this freedom." "You don't have to," James replied, smiling warmly. "This is just the beginning. You can decide what comes next, and I'll be here not to control but to support you in every choice." Days turned into weeks, and Naya's confidence continued to grow. She began taking small leadership roles on the ranch, helping organize supplies, training new helpers, and overseeing tasks that had once been beyond her reach. The other workers began to see her not just as someone who had endured, but as someone capable and strong. They learned to respect her, and in turn, she felt a sense of belonging that she had never known. James noticed the change in her, the way her posture was more upright, her gaze more certain and her words more confident. He felt proud not because he had created this change, but because he had witnessed it. Naya had discovered her own power, and that was a gift no one could take away. One evening, as the sun set and the plains glowed in shades of gold and orange, James took Naya's hand. His expression was gentle, full of warmth and respect. "Naya," he said softly, "I want to ask something. Will you be my partner, not just here on the ranch, but in life? I want to share the future with you as equals, supporting each other." Naya felt a rush of emotion. She looked into his eyes, seeing honesty, care, and respect. For the first time in her life, she realized that love could exist without fear, without control, and without pain. It could exist as a partnership, built on trust, shared experiences, and mutual respect. "Yes," she whispered, her voice filled with certainty and hope. "I will." From that day forward, their lives changed together. They worked side by side on the ranch, explored the plains, and planned for a future that was theirs to shape. Naya was no longer defined by her past. She was defined by her choices, her courage, and her ability to step into freedom. Neighbors and visitors often remarked on the transformation, both in Naya and in the ranch. The story of her journey spread quietly, inspiring others to see that courage and support could create change, even in the harshest of circumstances. Naya became a symbol of strength, resilience, and hope, a living reminder that the past does not define the future. As the years passed, Naya and James continued to build their life together. They expanded the ranch, welcomed new challenges, and faced hardships with determination. Through it all, their bond remained strong, rooted in respect, trust, and shared experiences. Naya had found freedom, love, and purpose, and in doing so, she had discovered that life, even after darkness, could be beautiful, full of possibilities, and filled with hope. And so, on the wide open plains under the vast sky, Naya's laughter could be heard once again, free and unburdened. She had survived, she had grown, and she had chosen a life of strength, dignity, and love. The story of the Apache woman who had once been trapped now became a story of courage, resilience, and a future she could shape with her own hands, always alongside the man who had believed in her when no one else did.